You know, it's funny. I saw somebody make a comment. It was a joke, where they said, "Who are you voting for in the 2029 election, Mark Carney or Doug Ford?" And I just thought it was kind of funny because, like, Doug Ford is in a riding that is a little more purple, and you know, part of his advantage there is the fact that he's a little more to the center, right? I don't think that if he was perceived as somebody that was fully bought into the Poilievre camp, that he would necessarily do as well in Ontario as he does. I think people see him as more of like an independent than an actual conservative, right? Like he kind of has his own views on things, and he's willing to work with whatever prime minister gets in there. That's literally what he said, right? And, you know, to be fair, he had just gotten a mandate in his own province as well. And the way he had framed it was that we're going to be busy. We don't really have a lot of time to help him campaign. And I don't know the way that he answered that. I think that it was more of a thing like, we're not going to be spending a whole bunch of time on that instead of responding to the needs of people in Ontario. That's kind of the impression I got. I don't think it ever was like a rebuke of Poilievre. I think that part of it was overstated, and both campaigns kind of went out on a limb and said that they weren't trying to rebuke the other one, that they were just, he was not able to kind of give them the help that they were asking for. Or actually, I don't even know if that's because they denied that as well, right? But like, that is kind of the impression that I got, that he just said he wasn't going to be like helping with the Poilievre campaign.
Yeah, I guess people
plate.
Also took it more of as because of how friendly he was being with Mark Carney, with the breakfast, with a couple other things, with him saying Mark Carney's a great guy, all this kind of stuff, kind of almost giving him a non-endorsement, but somewhat of an endorsement of approval. Or at least approval.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as far as a conservative premier would go, yeah, that is basically an endorsement, right?
Yeah. So I think that's where the speculation comes in with Doug Ford, why he's being rejected a little bit by the conservative audience, which at this point, Poilievre, you know, till recently was doing very popular in Ontario, arguably almost more popular than the Liberals at one point, which is not very surprising to see that shift there. However, it's the Quebec support, I feel like, that's going to definitely be setting the tone with this upcoming election. And it's, you might have seen recent panels on CTV and elsewhere talking about it, you know, basically saying how the Quebec support is a big deal. And Poilievre is seemingly taking a very firm stance in this. But anyways, actually, I do have a clip I'm going to play. Check this out.
I've been following polls in Canada, provincially, federally, for the past decade, and I've never seen such a sharp turnaround.
These lines are from CBC's Poll Tracker, which combines every publicly available poll going back months. As recently as January 6th, you can see the tracker had the Liberals at just 20% support, with the Conservatives more than double that.
This national horse race number, it actually means nothing. Nobody's going to look at the regional data. I go as granular as you possibly can. The next place I look at is Quebec, because it's an interesting entity all its own, and some pollsters are good at measuring Quebec and others aren't. So here in Alberta, and to a lesser extent in Canada, there is this trend where pollsters tend to underestimate Conservative voters. Now, there's other mistakes that pollsters can make, but just making sure you have enough Conservatives in your sample, we call them shy Tories. That's one of the common mistakes that gets made. And so
thanks, Sarah, for sharing that clip in our Discord. I want to talk about that clip there, just because the main thing that they're saying, how two factors that could really play in Pierre's favor here, given Pierre's recent stance doing a French-only rally in Quebec City after Mark Carney canceled his in Quebec City. Just so you know, Mark Carney canceled his there. So only Pierre Poilievre has done one there so far. Getting that Quebec vote, which is something that's underrepresented on the polls, which makes sense because most of these polls are also probably done by English-speaking analysts who are not calling Francophones, right? And I think that's why the number from Quebec might not always be accurate, because they probably are calling a lot of people, but maybe they're not getting quite an adequate feel for how Quebecers are really feeling. As well as the Conservative vote being underrepresented. And I think there's multiple arguments to this. I think, in my opinion, this election, you're going to see a lot of people who have not voted before vote. And I think a big part of these polls is the way they contact people. From what I understand is they get your information from former voter registries. So if you're also someone who hasn't voted before or hasn't voted in a long time, you might not get contacted for a poll, from what I understand.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think
Poilievre is the type of person who activates that type of voter.
Well, and exactly.
And that's something that I've always given him credit for. I think he's just he reaches people that are not in the usual voter base. And it's because of things, and Trudeau is like this too, right? People really like to see somebody who stands up and calls out the guy that everybody doesn't like, right? And Trudeau did that to Harper, and Poilievre has turned out to be, his own version of that to Trudeau. And I think that it's, I always, almost every day since this has happened, I have a moment where I feel bad for Pierre Poilievre, because I just think about how this was such a slam dunk for him. He was going up against the guy who he had essentially been David and Goliath against for the last, 3 years. And now he's against a whole new guy who has basically revolved a lot of his campaign around the differentiating himself from Trudeau, right? And it's just going to be interesting to see how that kind of plays out with the public, because the messaging from the Conservatives is that Poilievre and, Mark Carney might as well have been Trudeau's shadow. And that's in my opinion, I think in the reality is that it's not even close to that. I mean, while simultaneously saying that, they'll also bring up how he was on the board of Goldman Sachs, and he was on the board of Brookfield, and he was on the board of Bloomberg, and he was on so many different boards. I think he was I might be overestimating it here, but I feel like he was on 60 different boards at the time.
Yeah, and I think
and so the idea that he was spending all this time with Justin Trudeau is just I just can't see it.
Well, no, but at the same
silly.
time, he won't disclose what he won't take credit, for any, he hasn't said what he advised Trudeau on and didn't advise him on, right? And I think that's where Carney should provide some transparency if he wants to put those concerns to rest, especially for those undecided voters or possible conservative voters that might. I just don't feel like there's that many who would go the other way, because everybody wants change, right? And I think at the end of the day, they don't see change, even with a new face at the head of the Liberal Party. It's still the Liberal Party. It's still the same old red they've been seeing for the last 9.5 years. And I think that they want change. And I think the real way you're going to get change is by voting in another party. In all honesty, just naturally you will, especially with these two, because ideologically there is a culture within these parties that is very different. And I think you're going to see a very different approach to government. Whether or not that's a good thing, I guess some people can argue. I think it's a good thing personally, because I think we do need someone who's going to be willing to make some tough calls and is willing to have an aggressive approach that's going to help kind of get our economy back on track here. And I think that's the biggest threat. And arguably, I think the reason why there is support for Carney right now, why Carney is calling this election so quickly, is because if he had waited till October, he probably wouldn't have won. Because I think the Trump issue itself, he knows without this Trump issue, he's got nothing. I think that's arguably what it is.
I think it's a little more than that, though.
Because all he can offer
I think
is
it's more
policies that Poilievre's already said he'd do. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that, there's plenty more where that came from. You can find the link to the full episode in the description below. Click now, watch, and get grounded with all of us. Thanks for watching.